idea that really a neighborhood needs to be three things, and this is aspirational. This is an aspirational understanding of neighborhood and the thesis I developed. And that neighborhood, and I'll just run through what these three things are. First of all, neighborhood needs identity of some sort. It needs to have a name. People need to know whether they're in it or not, or they're outside of it. Maybe some sort of center that functions as the identity, the physical identity of the neighborhood. And you'd be how many don't have that identity at all. So they don't even really have a name. People wouldn't be able to name where they are. A sense of connection. Is Michael Mahaffey around? I stole this graphic from Michael Mahaffey. He was making a point in one of his research papers about how neighborhood needs to have internal and external connection, and I think that is absolutely essential. And then thirdly, and this is something I don't think New Urbanism pays that much attention to, and that is the political representation of neighborhood. There has to be some way that neighborhoods can function collectively and have some kind of voice that is a means of governance. So you kind of put these three things together. Why do we need to have these? I lay out a series of reasons as to why this understanding of neighborhood is important. One of them having to do with neighborhoods thus defined as having identity and connection and collective voice are really the neighborhoods, I think, where they're kind of ground zero for urban cultural wars going on right now and gentrification. These are the neighborhoods that, at least in my city and many other cities, are very desirable. And people really want to live there when you have a neighborhood with identity and connection and collective voice. And so we need to grow more of these kinds of neighborhoods that have it all together like that. The ability, if a neighborhood thus defined has a sense of ownership, has a sense of caring for place, and that's really important. The notion of, I talk a lot in the book about diversity and how defining neighborhood is often a way of, or has historically been a way of excluding, and that has been a really big problem. We need to be able to have neighborhoods that are inclusive. And I forget the other reason. So the book also goes through the historical record on neighborhood, what archaeologists have been able to uncover about, going back to Bronze Age neighborhoods, physical imprint of spatial clustering of people on the land since the very dawn of time. There's an interesting person in China who has been running around creating contemporary digital imagery of what neighborhood units look like in China in ancient cities. This happens to be one of his renderings from 8th century China. We have, I have a lot of different historical examples of basically clustering of housing and from all time periods and all parts of the globe. I really like this study that was done of 17th century Dutch city, Alkmaar. And what's interesting about this is showing different rent levels. And so there's a really wide variation of income levels going on in these neighborhoods in this Dutch city. So one of the things that I was happy to discover in my research was that neighborhoods were in fact very culturally and economically diverse. As you would expect, these were walking cities. We didn't have the ability to separate ourselves spatially the way we had the ability after the car and the streetcar and the car came along. So it's basically a story of the cellular dynamic of urban change. As cities are growing and expanding, it's by way of cellular expansion, and there's plenty in the historical record to to verify that. So that cellular dynamic of urban change is happily moving along in urban history, and then wham, the industrial city happens. The century of industrial urbanization, the 19th century, really explodes everything out, and you no longer have cities growing by this cellular dynamic. And one of the things that happens is that these folks, these very first sociologists, they formed something called the Chicago School of Sociology, and they were very upset by what was happening with this, industrial city and the loss of neighborhood-based urban growth. You might have heard of some of these guys: Roderick Mackenzie, Charles Gordon Cooley. You have, I don't know, I'm blocking here, but these are famous white dead guys who are the bedrock of sociology even today. Is David Brain here? He can help me out. So Durkheim and Weber, those guys, you've heard of them. And so they were really upset by what was happening, and they wrote all these books about how we really needed to get the neighborhood back. And they teamed up with urban planners. And urban planning at this time, this is early 20th century, was just becoming a field. And so the urban planners of the world started really taking that message from the urban sociologists to heart, and they just started to devise these plans for neighborhoods. And one of the first was, or the early conceptions, actually Ebenezer Howard had neighborhoods in the Garden City. And 1912, they did a neighborhood contest in Chicago. Please go out and design the perfect neighborhood, the ideal neighborhood, using these ideas from the sociologists. And these are beautiful, beautiful, almost works of art. They look like mosaic pieces. You can still get the book out of the local library of all these beautiful renderings. Frank Lloyd Wright was one of the first, people to enter this contest, and he didn't win, and apparently he was not very happy about that. Some of these neighborhoods, so the next thing that happens is this idea of planning cities by neighborhood, reacting against that industrial city expansion. It takes off, and it happens all over the world, and here's Canberra being designed by Walter Burley Griffin, neighborhood-based. And then you had people like Clarence Perry, who was a sociologist, devising his understanding of neighborhood, and his becomes the most famous because it's really the most, well, first of all, it happened in New York, and it was as part of the New York regional plan work. But it was, he really fleshed it all out, and he had it all decided. He had various versions. This is the version you might be familiar with the neighborhood at the center, or the school at the center, community center, churches, 5-minute walk. He had different versions. This is his neighborhood for an industrial, he called it an industrial neighborhood. And then you had modernist versions of various kinds. Now you start to get the neighborhood in different forms, but still very much an impulse to try to design the city via this neighborhood structure. Chandigarh, Corbusier getting in the game. This is Kuwait, 1960s, so all over the world. Urban Land Institute gets in the game. Pretty soon you had neighborhoods being formed, this 1970s. This is the golf course neighborhood. So it's still this understanding of we need to plan cities by neighborhoods, but it starts to be in a whole myriad of different forms. Really takes off in the Soviet Union, really takes off throughout China. Neighborhood-based planning, which they often got from the American planners, China got it from America via the Soviet Union. So that's all in the first half of the book. Second half of the book is about, it gets more academic, and I've had some people come up to me and say, your book is too dense, you know, and it is an academic book. It's not like light reading, it's more for probably a graduate level course, but I get into what I think have been different ways that the neighborhood has been problematized over, you know, since the very first understandings of neighborhood planning. It's sort of devolved. And one of the debates that happens is related to design, different design particulars. How do you define the boundaries of a neighborhood? And that's part of it, the boundaries, the centers, what are the street patterns within a neighborhood? What does that have to do with neighborhood structure? All of that has been written about extensively, and I just try to summarize it all. Neighborhood boundaries are really interesting in and of themselves. How do you define that? The planners got really involved in that early on, and this was a publication in 1960 where they were really stressing about the boundary between a black neighborhood and a white neighborhood on the south side of Chicago, and they decided, you know, what we need to do is have this boundary, which is this commercial area, function like a seam rather than a boundary, and we can actually pull this predominantly non-white population and this white population together via that seam. And that's the way the boundary was supposed to work. And of course, if you know anything about Chicago, this Stony Island Avenue on the south side of Chicago is just not a very nice place and does not at all function like a seam, unfortunately. Another kind of debate, aside from that design kind of debate, is can neighborhoods even be planned in the first place? And this debate actually is very old. There was a lot of critique of what Clarence Perry was doing, and people reacted negatively to that early on. And this is things like, you know, it's ridiculous to plan a neighborhood. That's not how cities grow and function, and you're doing something very artificial. So the reaction to that was to conceive of neighborhoods in very different ways. Let's have neighborhoods that are just cognitive. Let's have neighborhoods that are individual cognitive conceptions of things. This is Terrence Lee's conception. This is, I'm sorry this is cut off here, but this is a study from 1941 already, somebody's PhD dissertation about how each individual has their own conception of neighborhoods, so it really is impossible to plan them. Another approach was, I kid you not, to not call it neighborhood, don't use that term neighborhood. Instead, this was a proposal from a report in the UK in the early 1960s. Instead, we're going to call them environmental areas. And those are the boundaries of neighborhoods. Just don't ever use that term. Then there is debate about neighborhood self-governance. Is that really a good thing or a bad thing? There's pros and cons. I love this image of an immigrant neighborhood gathering in 1920 Chicago. What? We're doomed. But the subtitle of this is about, describes what was happening here, these immigrants coming together to consider neighborhood improvements. So, so that was kind of the structure of governance in one location there. You might be surprised at this. This is IAF. Anybody know what that is? Saul Alinsky, right? Saul Alinsky and his great neighborhood organizing. And Saul Alinsky, who inspired President Obama about neighborhood organizing, they thought neighborhood was a bad thing because it didn't give you political power, and it actually dissipated power. And actually you'll find a lot of those in the Marxist realm, and Marxism is alive and well in academia, you'll be happy to know, but it's, you know, Marxists don't think much of neighborhoods because of this reason. You're not really getting at the structural roots of inequity and and you're not allowing people to have enough political voice. And then another kind of debate I go through is about social confusion. This was a panel from one of these neighborhood, pro-neighborhood kind of, I forget who's the source of this, but anyway, the Museum of Modern Art sponsored this exhibition on neighborhood in the, right after World War II, and this exhibition traveled the country, and it was all this stuff about how, you know, if you had neighborhood, you would be a good citizen, you would like other people, you would get together with other people, you would be a responsible citizen, and so neighborhood is really very much about social control. And it even went so far as you had people like Eliel Saarinen saying, you know, if you're not neighborhood structured in your city, you are diseased. This is diseased cells, this is healthy cells. And so, you know, there was a lot of really kind of perverse interpretations of what neighborhoods were supposed to be and how they were supposed to be structured. And this led to a lot of confusion about what the social implications of neighborhood structure were. But of course, the problem here, and what I struggle with, and the debate is about, is that of course neighborhood form does have an impact on how we interact with people. And Donald Appleyard certainly showed that with his studies of the relationship between social interaction and traffic volume. And here he is showing that, you know, a lot of people interacting with light traffic, heavy traffic, nobody's really interacting. So that's just one example of how we know that form impacts social connection, but sometimes it just goes too far, and so we have to kind of find that balance. And then finally, neighborhood as a basis of social segregation. And this has been by far the most difficult thing to understand or to kind of come to terms with. On the one hand, we like the idea of neighborhood, we like what it does for all those reasons I mentioned at the beginning, but it is very much associated with segregation. And this is one of the, perhaps the earliest public housing that was in Cleveland in 1937, public housing development on a large scale, and it was neighborhood based, and it was all about implementing the neighborhood. And you know, you can see it was just kind of a recipe for segregating people into their own little enclave, and that you know, continues on today with developers marching across the land, building by neighborhood, but it's really a tool of segregating people. So how do we move on from all of this? I think that this is, I love this image of the neighborhood structure of Plymouth in the UK, which was really bombed out during World War II. And the planners wanted to get their city back, and so one of the first things they did is they just tried to map out where the neighborhoods were, where they were existing. And then they went from there, they started to think about, well, how can we get, not use neighborhoods as a tool of social segregation, but have more diversity within them. So I think that there is, this is my last slide. I think there is a way, and you'll have to read the book to know what the answer is here, but there is a way to kind of work through these different pros and cons about neighborhood structure, neighborhood as something place-based and physical with identity and boundaries and a center and diversity, and a way to work through all the problems that has inspired over the years. But it's not going to be easy, and I lay out some suggestions for what planners might do to kind of help rectify some of these problems with neighborhood. And my good friend Doug Farr has been trying to launch this thing called National Neighborhood Days. It was just launched in this spring, and we're trying to work out how we, and there's somebody in Providence who's involved in this too. Do you know who I'm talking about? You know how that parking days thing with everybody, and so it's kind of like that went, you know, viral in a very short amount of time. So we were wondering if we could have more interested neighborhood go viral too. But so that's, I'll stop there, and I'm happy to take questions and start a discussion.
I missed the beginning, Emily, so you may have said this, but as the person who's probably thought more about the word neighborhood than any other human now with your book, did you ever define, can you give us a one-sentence definition of what a neighborhood is?
Yeah, I did say
because we all use the term,
sure,
loosely.
Yeah, so neighborhood is defined in a million different ways, as you must know. So
how do you define it?
I define it as an aspirational thing, something that has identity, collective voice, and connection, both internal and external connection. Yes?
I've got two questions.
Okay.
The first one is, I think, the first question would be, I think it's the automobile-scaled city of post-war sprawl obviously played a huge role in demolishing the neighborhood. But your suggestion is that the industrial neighborhood really started to degrade the neighborhood structure that preceded it. I haven't read the book yet, but that's an intriguing thesis that puts the problem ahead of where I thought it was. Can you does the book talk about the processes by which the industrial city degraded the pre-existing fabric of the neighborhood?
Yeah, I get into that a bit, but it's mostly a question of scale and the inability to, just sort of the blowing up of the city.
Just the hypergrowth.
The hypergrowth, and the no longer having that, the constraints that led to that cellular dynamic of urban growth.
And then when you talk about how the sort of city sort of carried on, limped on, sort of developing in neighborhood form even in the 70s, and you showed is that not just a product of the same thing that drove the Garden City, which is just the fact that you need an economy of scale to develop, do land development? How much does the role of land development play in the perpetuation of the idea of neighborhood as the appropriate building block of the march of the city, but not necessarily with the neighborhood in mind, just the economics of the proposition in mind?
Yeah, I think that's one of those things where that's not necessarily what we should be going for.
I agree.
Yeah, okay. So neighborhood as a tool of suburban expansion. Yeah, definitely that's been a big thing. So, I mean, what I'm trying to do is lay out some ideas for how we might get the neighborhood in its aspirational sense back and wrestle it to the ground, I guess is a tacky way of putting it. But yeah, definitely it's been taken over and used for perverse purposes. That's a huge part of the neighborhood problem, the problem of neighborhood. And Clarence Perry, who played a big role in urbanism, he's sort of ground zero for some of these problems about too controlling, too enclave, not connected, insular, a tool of segregation. And then he was really racist as well. That's kind of a problem, big problem.
Not a surprise, though.
Yeah. I mean, some of his stuff, you're reading his stuff and you're like, oh God, please don't say that, because I like some of your ideas about the centrality of neighborhood and the identity, and I think that there were a lot of good things he had to say, but yeah, not all of it.
The Plymouth thing is interesting because Plymouth is sort of an odd duck. It's like a synologism of different films. Have you actually mapped what you think the scale of a neighborhood is in let's say in an old European city vis-a-vis a new American development, or even just in a large-scale American city? Do you have any sense of the plasticity of scale of neighborhoods?
Yeah.
The size. I mean, scale or size.
The size. Yeah. Well, there are recurrent ideas about that come out. And I have a separate paper that I published on a size typology. There's the face-to-face neighborhood. That's about, the limit of that is about 250 people, and that's where you actually know everyone. You're not friends with them necessarily, but you know them.
You recognize.
You recognize them. And so, yeah, anthropologists tell us the limits of face-to-face are 250 to 300 people. There's the urban corridor, which more European-based. That has a limit of 1,500 people. There is a neighborhood that's like a big high school. That's about maybe 2,500 to 3,000. That's really big. For a high school, but that's a neighborhood conception. Of course, Perry was 5,000. Jane Jacobs was talking about 10,000 people in a neighborhood. So there are these different kind of aspirations and regularities in the historical record of neighborhood size that I think we can think about. And at each one of these levels, you have to think about the diversity within them. And that's going to be different amounts.
That's a fascinating answer, by the way, because you actually answered not in physical scale,
But in population.
recognition. No, which is lovely.
Yeah.
And not what we wanted.
Not what you want.
Well, no. She explains it. Yeah. Okay, physical scale.
80 to 200 acres, how about that? No, actually,
European, like mature urbanism versus new urbanism.
But can't you answer it by just looking at names? Tribeca, South Village, East Village, right?
I mean, there are regularities to all of this, and the size typology paper, which I will send you, has not only population but acreage.
But size.
But you don't want to say.
Um,
Because we all say 5 minutes. We all say it
Emily,
It's
comes from
160.
heaven that it's a 5-minute walk. We all say that, are we right? It varies.
Aspirationally.
What other factors play a role?
Yeah, I think you're right, and I do talk a lot about the 5-minute walk as being important. I think the 5-minute walk has a lot of truth and merit in it, and the 10-minute walk for other functions. I don't know. I really hesitate to be like, here's the neighborhood size and its population
no,
and
my
acreage.
question was the plasticity of
Yeah.
the neighborhood.
As somebody who lives in Manhattan, I always get annoyed with the 5-minute walk.
Do
It
ya?
has nothing to do with the way that I live.
Okay. Tell us.
John, can you repeat that?
I just say that somebody who lives in Manhattan, I always get annoyed with the idea that the 5-minute walk is a thing, because it has nothing to do with the way that I live, the way that 3 million of my neighbors live, and I think it really varies according to density. in the neighborhood.
In terms of the size, I think it's interesting to think about it with the collective voice and social organizing and the identity piece, because those are not physical. Connectivity has a physical aspect to it. So when we're thinking about, how many people can share a common identity, how many people can organize in a way where they have political power, that's going to vary from place to place and based on the makeup of the group of people. So I think that's a really interesting lens that you put on it. Thank you.
Good answer.